Welcome to Chapter 10. In this chapter, we're going to talk all about meiosis, which is a form of cell division, and the sexual life cycles of living things. So in Part 1, we're really going to do an overview of important terms associated with meiosis. You might have just listened to a lecture on mitosis, and we got some terms there. But in order to understand meiosis, we need to have a better background and understanding of some basic genetics. So, when we think about passing on traits to the next generation, we often talk about how offspring resemble their parents, and that's true. But the reason that they resemble their parents is not because of the actual physical trait being passed on. It's actually due to heredity of passing on DNA. So heredity is the transmission of traits from one generation to the next. Now, if we look at this beautiful family here, we can see that that children don't look exactly like their parents. There's some variation, and variation is always seen in the appearance that's different from parents to offspring, but also variation between siblings. Genetics is the study of heredity and of variation. So literally, in a literal sense of the word, we're not passing down skin color itself. We do pass down the genes, the DNA that allows those melanin and things along those lines to be expressed. So we do have to talk about genes. And genes are the unit of heredity, but they're made up of segments or pieces of DNA. So genes are a small subset of DNA. If you look at this chromosome here, you might think that this whole thing is one gene, but that's not true. A gene is just a small subset of that DNA. They are passed down to the next generation in the cell type called the gamete, which I talked about in the last chapter. Gametes are sperm and eggs. Now, most DNA is packaged into the structure called the chromosome, which I talked to you about before. For us, like humans, we've got those 46 chromosomes. Remember that I did differentiate between our body cells or our somatic cells versus the sex cells. So in our somatic cells, we have 46 chromosomes. And that's also true for any cell that might lead to a gamete, but it's not actually a gamete. Now, each gene has a very, very specific location, or we use the word locus, on a chromosome. So the gene location is right here on this chromosome. Now, this is the same gene as this one because it's in the same locus, it's in the same location, but it might be a different version. So the different version of genes are called alleles. And this is the pink allele, and this is the blue allele, and here's where I'm like, well, this is not gendered. Okay, I'm not trying to gender this. I'm just saying that there are variations, and sometimes it's useful to look at colors when we're talking about variations because it's very visual. These lectures are very visual, and color is very visual. So also wanting you to know that this is not a female chromosome just because it's pink, nor a blue chromosome. It's actually, I'm really, really not even talking about the whole chromosome. I'm talking about the location on the chromosome. This is the location. This is the same location on a different version of the same chromosome. And since they have different versions of the gene, we say that they have different alleles. If you were going to look at asexual reproduction versus sexual reproduction, there's some pretty big differences. With asexual reproduction, one individual is going to pass all of its genes, as is, onto its offspring without any fusion of gametes. So here, this is a very cool little hydra here, and there's a bud coming off of it. And this whole thing has happened in the process of mitosis. And if this breaks off, then it'll form a new separate hydra, and that's a form of reproduction. This stand of redwoods have all grown out of the same root system, and so these are all clones, or they're exact copies. They have the same DNA. Their clones are identical copies of each other. When it comes to sexual reproduction, two parents give rise to offspring, and you have a unique combination of genes inherited from those two parents. And we might think about the term life cycle in order to describe how meiosis alternates and causes new generations to form. So when we think about life cycle, when we were kids, we always learned about the life cycle of butterflies. You know, it starts out as an egg, then you get a caterpillar, the caterpillar becomes a cocoon or a chrysalis, and it becomes the adult, and the adults lay eggs. And that's a basic life cycle, but we don't often think about humans as having a life cycle, but we do. We have a very similar life cycle. You know, we start out as an infant, right? You're born, and that infancy lasts for about 12 months. You have the toddler years, preteen and teenage years, and then eventually you become sexually reproductive. Not that you will reproduce, it's just that your body is probably capable of reproducing, and that puts you into the grown-up stage. I know this diagram is meant for kids, but I think it's very useful because we don't often think about ourselves as having a life cycle like butterflies do. So another thing that will be very helpful in trying to get our heads around how this sexual reproduction process is going, this meiosis process, is to really look at the chromosomes for humans. And I've said this before, and it's going to keep coming up because we do talk an awful lot about humans, that humans have, in your somatic cells, remember they're your body cells, there are 23 pairs of chromosomes, which adds up 23 times 2, because a pair means 2, of having a total of 46 chromosomes. And if we look at a picture of those chromosomes, like you see right here, this is called a karyotype, you can count them up, and you can count 46 chromosomes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so forth. So a karyotype is just an ordered display of the pairs of chromosomes. This is the pair right here. This is pair number 1, and this is pair number 2, and this is pair number 3. Notice that these pairs are not connected to each other. They're not sister chromatids. They're not. There's something else, and that something else that they are is homologous chromosome, or we might use the word homologs to describe them. And if you don't want to say homologous chromosomes, you can say homologs. So these two are homologs or homologous chromosomes, or you could also say homologous pairs. And they each have the same name. They're chromosome number 1. One was given from mom, and one was given from dad. Same thing for chromosome 2. And you can see in this karyotype, they go from like the longest chromosomes, like 1, 2, and 3 are the longest chromosomes, all the way down to the shortest chromosomes. Chromosomes 21 and 22 are the shortest ones. Notice that if you took 22 and you multiplied that times 2, you'd have 44. But humans, we have 46 chromosomes. So how does that work? And there are these other 2 chromosomes right here. These chromosomes are called the sex chromosomes. So, and I'll go into that a little bit on the next slide. But when we say, and really want to emphasize this idea of homologous chromosomes, that they are very, very, very similar, but they're not identical. Sister chromatids are identical. Homologous chromosomes have genes located at the same locus, right? So here is a gene for flower color right there, and the same location on the homologous chromosome right there. but they have different versions. So maybe this is an allele for white flowers, and this is an allele for purple flowers. Color coding is a little misleading here. Don't worry about it. Just know that we have different alleles or different versions, and that's what makes the homologous chromosomes different. Again, they're not attached at the centromere, which is right here. They're not attached there. They're separate entities, and so we can count them as separate chromosomes. But they are homologous to each other. Same basic information, just different versions. We say that homologous chromosomes have the same length and the same shape and carry the same genes for the same characteristics, but maybe they have different versions. Again, wanting to focus here on the sex chromosomes for a second, and notice that their names are X and Y. And why they're named X and Y doesn't matter. It doesn't really mean anything except for that they are different from all of the other 23 chromosomes. Because in a human female that's genetically female, she would have 2 of those X chromosomes. And a human male who's genetically male would have 1 X chromosome and 1 Y chromosome. Although we will learn that there are some variations on that. So the rest of these other 22 pairs have their own name. Remember, these are the sex chromosomes. Sex chromosomes. These are called, the rest of them are called autosomes. And don't ask me why it gets the name autosomes. It just does. So that's what we call chromosomes numbered 1 through 22. Each pair of chromosomes includes 1 chromosome from each parent. So whenever I'm going to do math with you in this class, in this lecture, I've got the picture of the kid banging its head against the chalkboard because math is hard sometimes. But this math is fairly straightforward. 46 chromosomes in a human somatic cell, 2 sets of 23, 1 from mom, 1 from dad. We use the term diploid to describe the fact, and this is math here, that they have 2 sets of chromosomes. So a diploid cell has 2 sets of chromosomes, where N, and this is math, N means part of the set. So the math here is 46 is equal to 2N. 2N equals 46. The diploid number 2N is equal to 46. And those terms are very important for you to remember. In a cell where DNA synthesis has occurred, each individual chromosome, each of those homologous chromosomes are replicated. So we have here 2 homologous chromosomes, and when they undergo replication, each one of those has this little bit of an X shape to them. Again, don't confuse X shape with X chromosome. Very different things. And each of them has undergone that replication. They're both, this one is still homologous to this one, right? It's just that they're replicated. So this has 2 chromatids, and this has 2 chromatids. We also say sister chromatids. But this is still just 1 chromosome, and this is still just 1 chromosome. So over here we have 2 chromosomes, and over here we have 2 chromosomes. This is important for understanding the math of cell division. Let's take a simpler example. Here we have a 2N equals 6. So our diploid number is 6, and if we kind of look at what this N really means that we've been mentioning over the last 2 slides, N is equal to half the amount of information. So you can think of how mom gave you a set of chromosomes, but she only gave you 3, 1, 2, 3. And dad gave you a paternal set of chromosomes where N is also equal to 3, 1, 2, 3. You could even look for which ones are homologous. Like this one, we call this chromosome A. That's homologous to this one right here, right? And if this one is chromosome B, that's homologous to this one right here. And maybe this one is C here, and here. You can also use numbers, 1, 2, and 3 instead of A, B, and C. Also notice in this diagram that sister chromatids are formed. So that this is one chromosome that's replicated, connected at the centromere, attached at the centromere, is made up of 2 chromatids, 2 sister chromatids. Here's a really other important concept, and that's the concept of the non-sister chromatid. A non-sister chromatid is how you would talk about the chromatid found on homologous pairs. So this one right here, but its homolog has a sister chromatid too, but it's not connected to it. So we would say these are non-sister chromatids that belong to a homologous pair. So if we're going to start thinking about what happens during sex, so sex is really the preparation that your body goes through in order to sexually reproduce is making gametes. Remember, sperm or egg are gametes. And we're going to have to cut in half the amount of information that's available in those cells. So in gametes, they only contain a single set of chromosomes. And we say those cells are haploid. We've been using the word diploid before when we were talking about having 2 sets of chromosomes. And now we're using the term haploid, and the mathematical term here is N, to describe having half of the number of chromosomes, or you could say having a single set of chromosomes. For humans, the haploid number is 23, so we would say N is equal to 23. Remember when we looked at the karyotype, and we saw that each set of chromosomes was made up of 23 pairs? Well, now we have each consisting of exactly 23 chromosomes. Remember that 22 of those were autosomes, and you also have to have a single sex chromosome in there. So if you have an unfertilized egg, the sex chromosome is always going to be X. But in a sperm cell, the sex chromosome could be either X or Y. So the sperm is what causes or determines the genetic gender of an offspring. What would happen if you didn't go through meiosis? What would happen if you stayed having this exact same number of chromosomes in the egg as you have in somatic cells? Well, you would, just looking here at X's and Y's for sex determination, this egg would have 2 X's, and this sperm would have an X and a Y, so they don't separate, and you'd have a zygote that has 3 X's and a Y. Now, while that is possible, it's generally speaking not possible for it to happen with most of the chromosomes that exist in our genome. So we need to cut those numbers in half. At fertilization, when sperm joins with egg, that's when we start to have this structure called the zygote. This is the fertilized egg. And this fertilized egg has 1 set of chromosomes from each parent, 1 from mom and 1 from dad. And that's why we can now say that this zygote is diploid. It has 2 complete sets, 1 from mom and 1 from dad. After that fusion of egg and sperm happens, this zygote here can start to go through the division process of mitosis, and that's how development happens from a single-celled organism into a multi-celled organism. So we look at this idea of the cell cycle, the human life cycle again. At sexual maturity, genetically females make eggs often, most of the time, but not always. There's always variations. Males will make sperm, again, often there's always variations. But we go through the process of meiosis at the level of the ovaries. And once meiosis happens, our eggs are haploid and our sperm is haploid. And it's not until fertilization happens that we get the diploid zygote, where we have 46 chromosomes, or 2n. Our diploid number is 46. At this point, we go through mitosis and development. That's that type of cell division that we talked about earlier, when we have two exact copies of an original cell, and this happens millions and millions, if not billions and trillions of times, and you develop into a fully formed multicellular adult having 46 chromosomes. So that's where I'm going to stop for part 1 of chapter 10. When we join back together again, I'm going to dive deeply into the process of meiosis and talk a lot about the similarities and differences between mitosis and meiosis as we're going along. But for now, process of meiosis is coming up.